In sleepy Flaxborough, bride Edna Bryce insists she married dead groom Owen Hartley. Inspector Purbright quietly unravels wedding bells, blackmail schemes, and perfectly poisoned plans in this delightfully twisted mystery. Now then, dear listener, where in the world are you joining us from today? I'd love to know where this peculiar tale of Flaxborough's domestic complications is reaching you. The morning of the Flaxborough Horticultural Society's spring exhibition had dawned with that particular quality of English optimism that manifests itself in the hanging of bunting, despite meteorological evidence to the contrary. By 9:30, the parish hall wore its annual transformation like a dowager in her best hat, dignified, slightly overwhelming, and possessed of the quiet authority that comes from 3 decades of competitive gardening. Mrs. Hilda Polkinghorne, whose tenure as chairwoman had survived 2 changes of vicar and 1 unfortunate incident involving prize-winning marrows and the church mice, surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a general reviewing well-drilled troops. The trestle tables stood in precise formation beneath their starched white cloths, each bearing placards lettered in Mrs. Polkinghorne's uncompromising hand: daffodils, trumpet, vegetables, amusing shapes, and, in the corner reserved for the more ambitious entries, floral arrangements, interpretive. The air hummed with that peculiar blend of competitive tension and enforced civility that characterizes all gatherings where rosettes are at stake. Miss Teatime from the library fussed over her pressed flower display, which she had arranged to illustrate scenes from Wordsworth, and which bore an uncomfortable resemblance to botanical carnage. Mr. Grope, whose allotment bordered the railway cutting, muttered darkly about slug damage while arranging his runner beans with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. It was into this atmosphere of genteel warfare that Inspector Purbright had wandered, drawn not by any passion for horticulture, but by the civic duty of showing interest in activities that kept the citizenry occupied with pursuits more wholesome than those that usually required police attention. He stood near the entrance, observing with mild fascination the way Mrs. Chubb had managed to coax her chrysanthemums into formations that suggested military precision rather than natural growth. Sergeant Love, whose own gardening extended no further than mowing the patch of grass behind his lodgings, maintained his position by the tea-urn with the strategic awareness of a man who understood that social events were best navigated from fixed positions with ready access to refreshment. His melancholy expression suggested a man contemplating the mysterious ways in which duty led one to spend Tuesday mornings admiring other people's vegetables. The morning's routine was proceeding with the measured inevitability of a church service when Mr. Winch from the registrar's office appeared in the doorway with the harried expression of a man bearing news that no one particularly wanted to hear. He clutched a manila folder to his chest as if it contained either state secrets or his own death warrant, and his usually pale complexion had achieved a shade that Mrs. Polkinghorne would have described as interesting had it appeared on a flower. "Mrs. Polkinghorne," he called across the hall, his voice carrying the sort of penetrating quality that comes from genuine distress rather than mere social awkwardness. "I wonder if I might, that is, there's been a, oh dear." The effect of this announcement was immediate and comprehensive. Conversations died mid-sentence, teacups paused halfway to lips, and even the prize-winning roses seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Mrs. Polkinghorne, whose experience of public crises extended from burst water mains to disputed judging decisions, fixed Mr. Winch with the sort of look that had once caused a bishop to reconsider his position on flower arranging in the chancel. "Mr. Winch," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall, "if this concerns the usual difficulties with the marriage register, I must remind you that we have a schedule to maintain." "It does concern marriages," said Mr. Winch, advancing into the hall with the reluctant determination of a man walking toward his own execution. "Or rather, a marriage. This morning's ceremony, the 12 o'clock wedding, there's been a complication." He paused, swallowed audibly, and continued with the air of a man who had rehearsed this speech several times and found it wanting on each occasion. "The groom, Mr. Owen Hartley, has been found dead in his lodgings. Mrs. Spink discovered him at 10:30 when she took up his morning tea." The silence that followed this announcement was of the Profound variety, usually reserved for moments of genuine social catastrophe. It was broken eventually by Mrs. Chubb's whispered observation that she had always thought there was something not quite right about commercial travellers, a sentiment that rippled through the assembled company with the speed of scandal and the authority of received wisdom. Inspector Purbright, whose professional instincts had been quietly stirring since Mr. Winch's appearance, stepped forward with the measured calm that had served him well through 2 decades of Flaxborough's various domestic crises. "When you say found dead, Mr. Winch, I assume Dr. Havelock has been summoned." "Oh, yes, Inspector. Dr. Havelock attended immediately. He was quite definite about the matter, said there was no doubt whatsoever. Natural causes, he thought, though he mentioned something about the heart. A young man, too, couldn't have been more than 30. And the bride?" Purbright inquired, though something in Mr. Winch's expression suggested that this was precisely where the morning's complications lay. "That's rather the difficulty, Inspector. Miss Edna Bryce. She works at Gash's Drapers. She's here. In the vestry. She's asking whether she might still be married to him." This statement produced a collective intake of breath that might have deflated a small balloon. Mrs. Polkinghorne's eyebrows achieved an altitude that suggested either extreme surprise or the onset of a migraine, while several of the ladies near the prize vegetables exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the declining standards of modern courtship. It was at this moment that Miss Edna Bryce herself appeared from the side door that connected the hall to the church vestry. She moved with the careful dignity of a woman who was acutely aware of being the subject of intense scrutiny and had decided to meet it head-on rather than retreat. She was perhaps 25, dressed in a simple cream-colored dress that had clearly been chosen for its suitability as wedding attire, and she carried herself with a composure that was either admirable or slightly unnerving, depending on one's view of appropriate responses to domestic tragedy. "Inspector Purbright," she said, addressing him directly with the sort of quiet determination that suggested she had identified him as the only person present who might provide useful answers. "Mr. Winch has explained the situation, but I wonder if you might clarify something for me." Purbright inclined his head slightly, a gesture that managed to convey both attention and the absence of any premature judgment. "Certainly, Miss Bryce. I signed the register at 20 minutes past 11, she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the hall despite its measured tone. "Owen, Mr. Hartley, was to join me at 12 o'clock. Mr. Winch tells me that because he has died we cannot be considered married, but it seems to me that if a man can court a woman for 3 months, propose marriage, post the banns and arrange the ceremony, he ought to be able to manage being married on the same day he dies. After all," she added with a slight smile that contained more steel than warmth, "punctuality was never his strongest virtue." The logic of this argument appeared to strike the assembled company with varying degrees of force. Several of the older ladies nodded approvingly. They had, after all, spent decades managing husbands whose relationship with punctuality was similarly casual. Others looked scandalized at the suggestion that death might be treated as merely another form of tardiness. Inspector Purbright found himself regarding Miss Bryce with the sort of quiet interest that usually preceded his more successful investigations. There was something in her manner, a combination of grief, determination, and what might have been relief, that suggested the morning's events were rather more complex than a simple case of unfortunate timing. "Miss Bryce," he said gently, "perhaps we might continue this conversation in more private circumstances. Sergeant Love, would you ask Dr. Havelock to meet us at Mrs. Spink's lodging-house? And Mr. Winch, if you would bring the relevant documentation." As the small party prepared to leave, Mrs. Polkinghorne cleared her throat with the authority of a woman accustomed to having the final word. "Inspector, I trust this unfortunate business won't interfere with the judging. We have the mayor arriving at 2 o'clock for the prize-giving. I'm sure we can arrange for life to resume its proper course." "Mrs. Polkinghorne," Purbright replied, though his tone suggested that the proper course of life in Flaxborough had just taken a rather interesting detour. As they walked toward the door, Inspector Purbright found himself reflecting that in his experience, brides who insisted on marrying dead men usually had rather compelling reasons for doing so. The nature of those reasons, he suspected, would prove to be considerably more illuminating than anything likely to emerge from the morning's horticultural competition. The last thing he heard as they left the hall was Mrs. Chubb's observation to her neighbour that she had always said there was something peculiar about quiet girls who worked in drapers' shops. Whether this was prescience or prejudice remained to be determined, but Inspector Purbright made a mental note to explore both possibilities with his customary thoroughness. The walk from the parish hall to Mrs. Spink's lodging house took them past the war memorial, where the morning's gossip was already beginning its familiar transformation from fact into folklore. Mrs. Grope, who had abandoned her runner beans to pursue more interesting developments, could be seen through the post-office window gesticulating with the sort of animated precision that suggested she was explaining the morning's events to anyone willing to listen. Miss Bryce walked between Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love with the measured pace of a woman who had given considerable thought to her circumstances and arrived at conclusions that satisfied her sense of propriety, if not conventional wisdom. Her composure continued to puzzle Sergeant Love, whose limited experience with bereaved fiancés had led him to expect at minimum some display of feminine distress. "Had you visited Mr. Hartley's lodgings before today?" Purbright inquired as they turned into Willow Street, past the butcher's shop, where Mr. Plum emerged to observe their unusual procession with undisguised curiosity. "Only once," Miss Bryce replied with the precision of someone who had been counting such things. "Owen felt it would be improper for me to call regularly, given Mrs. Spink's position as a respectable landlady. He was quite particular about maintaining appearances, and yet he was comfortable enough to propose marriage after 3 months' acquaintance." This from Sergeant Love, whose own romantic experiences had been sufficiently limited to make him curious about the mechanics of successful attachment. Miss Bryce considered this question with the sort of care usually reserved for mathematical problems. "Owen was a gentleman who understood the value of decisive action, Sergeant. He said that when a man found himself in possession of good fortune, he ought not to hesitate in securing it." Mrs. Spink's establishment appeared before them like a Victorian dowager reduced to taking in washing, dignified in its way, but bearing the unmistakable signs of genteel decline. The front garden showed evidence of Mrs. Spink's belief that both flowers and lodgers should be kept in neat rows and prevented from any behavior that might be construed as unseemly. Mrs. Spink herself materialized at the door with the sort of timing that suggested she had been watching from behind the lace curtains. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with the competent appearance that comes from years of managing other people's domestic arrangements and the slightly harried expression of someone who had spent the morning grappling with circumstances no amount of experience in the lodging-house business had prepared her to handle. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice carrying controlled distress. "Dr. Havelock is upstairs with the poor young man. Such a shock. I took up his morning tea at 10:30, as usual, and found him looking quite peaceful, as if he had simply chosen not to wake up." Dr. Havelock descended the narrow staircase at that moment, adjusting his spectacles with the air of a man who had completed an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Heart failure," he announced to the assembled group. "Sudden but not uncommon in gentlemen of sedentary occupation. He appears to have died sometime during the night, perhaps around 3 or 4 o'clock." Miss Bryce received this information with the same composed attention she had shown throughout the morning's proceedings. "Was he, that is, did he appear to have suffered?" "Not at all," Dr. Havelock assured her. "Quite peaceful, as Mrs. Spink observed. His room is prepared as if for an important occasion. Clothes laid out, everything in perfect order. Rather touching, really, the care he took for his wedding day." Inspector Purbright found himself studying Miss Bryce's face as she absorbed these details. There was something in her expression, not grief exactly, but a kind of thoughtful calculation that suggested the morning's events, while tragic, were not entirely unexpected. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we might examine the room ourselves?" Mrs. Spink led them up the narrow staircase with the measured tread of a woman who had spent years perfecting the balance between hospitality and propriety. The banister, polished smooth by countless hands, creaked its familiar protest as they reached the first-floor landing, where the smell of beeswax and yesterday's mutton competed for dominance in the close air. Owen Hartley's room occupied the front corner, its windows offering a view of the high street that would have allowed him to observe the morning's preparations at the parish hall. The irony of this arrangement was not lost on Inspector Purbright as he stepped across the threshold into what had become, through death's simple arithmetic, something requiring official attention. The room declared its occupant's character with the precision of a military inspection. A dark suit hung from the wardrobe door, pressed to perfection, and accompanied by a shirt, collar, and necktie arranged on the chest of drawers with mathematical precision. Even his shoes bore the sort of shine that suggested either extreme nervousness or habitual meticulousness. The single carnation in a narrow vase on the washstand had clearly been positioned with care, though it now drooped with the resignation of flowers that had outlived their purpose. He was always particular about his appearance, Miss Bryce observed from the doorway, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone making factual observations rather than emotional ones. Owen said that a commercial traveller's success depended entirely upon the impression he made in the first 30 seconds of an encounter. Dr. Havelock, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the deceased, straightened with the satisfied air of a professional whose initial diagnosis had withstood closer scrutiny. Heart failure, without question. The gentleman appears to have died peacefully sometime during the night. These things happen, particularly to men who carry the irregular stresses of commercial employment. Sergeant Love, ever practical in his approach to investigation, had begun examining the bedside table with the thoroughness of a man who understood that important truths often lurked in unimportant places. "What exactly did Mr. Hartley sell, if you don't mind my asking?" "Agricultural implements," Mrs. Spink replied, with the prompt efficiency of a landlady accustomed to providing character references. "Plows, harrows, seed drills, that sort of thing. Travelled throughout the county, calling on farmers and estate managers. Said it was steady work for a man who didn't mind keeping irregular hours." Inspector Purbright moved to the window, gazing down at the high street, where morning routine proceeded with determined normalcy. Mrs. Grope had emerged from the post office and was making purposeful progress toward the parish hall, no doubt bearing news that would transform the horticultural exhibition into something resembling a memorial service with prize vegetables. "Miss Bryce," he said without turning from the window, "you mentioned earlier that punctuality wasn't Mr. Hartley's strongest virtue, yet Mrs. Spink suggests he was quite reliable about business matters. Might you clarify that apparent contradiction?" The quality of silence in the room shifted, becoming charged with the sort of attention that precedes either revelation or careful editing of facts. When Miss Bryce finally spoke, her voice carried a note of precise consideration. "Owen was punctual about obligations, Inspector, his rent, his business appointments, his duties to his employers. But in personal matters, he preferred what he called flexible arrangements. Our courtship proceeded according to his convenience, rather than any particular schedule I might have preferred." Mrs. Spink nodded with vigorous agreement. "Oh yes, quite right. Never missed his rent day by so much as an hour. But I've known him to keep Miss Bryce waiting the better." Part of an evening when they had arranged to walk out together, Purbright's attention had been drawn to a small leather valise tucked beneath the dressing table, not hidden precisely, but positioned with a sort of casual deliberation that suggested it was meant to be unremarkable. It was compact, the sort of bag one might pack for a brief journey, and its slightly bulging sides suggested it contained more than a change of collar. "Had Mr. Hartley mentioned any travel plans beyond the honeymoon?" he inquired, his tone suggesting nothing more than routine thoroughness. Mrs. Spink considered this carefully. "Only Bournemouth, Inspector. He spoke of it often, the sea air, the change of scene. Though they weren't planning to leave until tomorrow morning." Miss Bryce's gaze found the valise, and for the briefest moment, something flickered behind her composed expression. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of thoughtful recognition that suggested the bag's presence was not entirely unexpected. Inspector Purbright made a mental note of this reaction, filing it alongside the morning's other small mysteries. In his experience, bridegrooms who died on their wedding day rarely packed bags for journeys they wouldn't live to take, unless those journeys had been planned with a different sort of permanence in mind. "Sergeant Love," Purbright said with the measured courtesy that transformed requests into inevitabilities, "perhaps you might examine that valise more thoroughly. The leather bag yielded its secrets, with the reluctant cooperation that characterized most evidence in Purbright's experience. Sergeant Love lifted the lid with the careful attention of a man who had learned that small discoveries often preceded large complications, and the contents arranged themselves before the assembled group like exhibits in a rather specialized museum. On top lay the expected items: shirts folded with commercial precision, a spare collar, toiletries arranged with the sort of methodical care that suggested either extreme nervousness or habitual organization. Beneath these mundane necessities, however, lay documents that painted a considerably more complex portrait of Owen Hartley's final intentions. Railway timetable. "Inspector," Love reported, lifting a well-thumbed booklet. "Dover services, not Bournemouth. And what appears to be—" He paused, examining a red-covered document with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for potentially explosive devices. "Insurance policy. Empire Mutual Reassurance Society." Miss Bryce's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the morning's revelations, showed the first hairline crack of genuine surprise. Her hands, previously folded with the patience of a woman accustomed to waiting, tightened perceptibly as Sergeant Love read the policy details aloud. "Marriage contingency policy," Love continued, his voice carrying the flat precision of official documentation. "Benefit payable in the event of death within 30 days of lawful marriage. Taken out last Tuesday. Beneficiary Miss Edna Bryce." The silence that followed this announcement possessed the particular quality that accompanies the discovery of information no one had expected to hear. Mrs. Spink's expression suggested a landlady grappling with the realization that her establishment had been harboring considerably more complexity than she had bargained for, while Dr. Havelock's professional detachment showed signs of strain as the morning's simple case of heart failure acquired unwelcome complications. "Dover," Miss Bryce said finally, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone testing the weight of unexpected knowledge. "Owen mentioned business opportunities abroad, but I understood we were to honeymoon in Bournemouth." "Perhaps," Purbright suggested gently, "Mr. Hartley's travel plans were more flexible than initially indicated." He had moved to examine the remaining contents of the valise, where a thick, leather-bound ledger nestled beneath the clothing, like a secret waiting to be discovered. The ledger proved to be the morning's most illuminating discovery. Its pages contained meticulous entries in Owen Hartley's precise hand, not the records of agricultural implement sales one might expect from a commercial traveler, but something far more interesting. Names, dates, and monetary amounts filled the columns with the sort of systematic thoroughness that suggested either exceptional bookkeeping or careful blackmail. Purbright recognized several of the names immediately. Councillor Tompkins, whose enthusiasm for municipal contracts had occasionally raised eyebrows. Mrs. Hartwell from the post office, whose handling of pension payments had been the subject of quiet speculation. Mr. Grope from the allotments, whose access to railway property had always seemed remarkably liberal for a man whose official employment lay elsewhere. "It appears," Purbright observed with characteristic understatement, "that Mr. Hartley's commercial activities extended beyond agricultural implements." Miss Bryce leaned forward slightly, her gaze taking in the ledger's contents with the sort of focused attention that suggested recognition rather than surprise. "Owen always spoke of supplementary income streams," she said carefully. "He believed a man of enterprise shouldn't limit himself to a single source of revenue." Mrs. Spink, whose landlady instincts had been finely tuned by years of managing the domestic arrangements of gentlemen whose private affairs often proved more complicated than their public personas, cleared her throat meaningfully. "I did notice Mr. Hartley received rather more callers than one might expect for a commercial traveller. Always very discreet, mind you, but there were gentlemen who preferred to conduct their business in the evenings. Sergeant Love, whose own approach to supplementary income had never extended beyond the occasional overtime payment, found himself studying the ledger with growing fascination. The final entry, dated the previous day, recorded a sum considerably larger than the others, accompanied by a name that made him glance sharply at Inspector Purbright. Purbright had noticed it as well. The entry that suggested Owen Hartley's final business transaction had involved someone whose cooperation would have been particularly valuable to a man planning an immediate departure from Flaxborough. The amount was sufficient to fund a comfortable journey to Dover and whatever opportunities awaited beyond, while the timing suggested that Hartley's wedding day had been chosen for reasons that extended beyond romantic sentiment. "Miss Bryce," he said, closing the ledger with deliberate care, "I wonder if you might accompany us to the station. There are certain administrative matters that require clarification, and I suspect your familiarity with Mr. Hartley's affairs may prove invaluable in resolving them efficiently." She nodded with the composed acceptance of a woman who had been anticipating such a request. "Of course, Inspector, though I should mention that Mr. Gash expects me back at the shop by 2 o'clock. He was understanding about this morning's circumstances, but business must continue." As they prepared to leave Mrs. Spink's establishment, Purbright found himself reflecting that the morning's simple case of untimely death had evolved into something considerably more complex. The combination of insurance fraud, systematic blackmail, and carefully planned escape suggested that Owen Hartley's heart failure, while undoubtedly natural, had occurred at a moment of remarkable convenience for several parties, not least Miss Bryce, whose composure in the face of such revelations suggested either admirable self-control or detailed foreknowledge of her late fiancé's various enterprises. The afternoon, he suspected, would prove considerably more illuminating than the morning's horticultural exhibition, though whether the truth would prove as palatable as Mrs. Polkinghorne's prize roses remained to be determined. The walk to the police station proceeded with the measured pace that Inspector Purbright had learned to appreciate in his dealings with Flaxborough's more complex domestic arrangements. Miss Bryce accompanied them with the sort of composed attention to propriety that suggested either admirable self-control or the careful preparation of someone who had anticipated this particular conversation. Her umbrella, carried despite the morning's clear skies, seemed less a precaution against weather than a symbol of readiness for whatever storms might lie ahead. The Flaxborough Constabulary occupied a Victorian building that had been designed to suggest both municipal authority and accessible justice, though the years had tipped the balance decidedly toward the former. Sergeant Love held the door with the courtesy of a man who understood that witnesses required delicate handling, particularly when those witnesses possessed information that might prove either invaluable or deeply incriminating. Purbright's office reflected his approach to police work, functional without being austere, organized without suggesting obsessive precision. The single window overlooked the high street, where the morning's gossip continued its transformation from fact into folklore. Miss Bryce settled into the chair across from his desk with careful attention to posture. Her gloves adjusted with the sort of unnecessary precision that suggested either nervousness or a lifetime of employment in establishments where deportment mattered considerably. "Miss Bryce," Purbright began, arranging Owen Hartley's leather ledger on his desk with deliberate care, "I wonder if you might help us understand the nature of Mr. Hartley's business relationships with the gentleman listed in these records." She considered the question with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for it since the moment the ledger's existence became apparent. "Owen was a man who noticed irregularities, Inspector. In his travels throughout the county, he encountered situations that struck him as professionally questionable. He believed that gentlemen in positions of responsibility should be made aware of such discrepancies. And this awareness took the form of regular payments?" "Owen preferred to think of them as consulting fees," Miss Bryce replied, with the precision of someone who had given considerable thought to appropriate terminology. He would offer guidance on how certain irregularities might be addressed, and the gentlemen involved would express their gratitude through modest financial acknowledgments of his discretion. Sergeant Love, whose own experience with consulting fees had been limited to the occasional gratuity from grateful citizens, found himself studying Miss Bryce with renewed fascination. Her explanation possessed the sort of careful logic that transformed systematic blackmail into a form of civic service. Though whether she believed this interpretation or simply found it convenient remained tantalizingly unclear. "The insurance policy," Purbright continued, opening the red-covered document with the sort of casual attention that made important things seem routine, "was arranged rather recently. Had Mr. Hartley expressed particular concerns about his health?" For the first time that morning, Miss Bryce's composure showed hairline cracks of genuine uncertainty. Her hands, previously folded with perfect stillness, moved to adjust her gloves with unnecessary attention to detail. Owen was always concerned about providing security, Inspector. He said that marriage was a serious responsibility and that a prudent man should prepare for all contingencies, including the contingency of immediate departure to Dover. The question settled into the room's quiet air, with the weight of accusation carefully disguised as professional curiosity. Miss Bryce met Purbright's gaze with the steady attention of a woman who had decided that carefully administered honesty might prove more useful than continued evasion. Owen had been investigating certain irregularities at the railway goods yard, she said finally, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone reciting facts that had been thoroughly rehearsed. He believed he had discovered evidence of systematic diversion, items being redirected from legitimate shipments and sold through private arrangements. The final entry in his ledger represents payment from someone who wished to avoid public examination of these activities. Purbright leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the manner of a man contemplating the pleasant complexity of human nature. And this someone, did Mr. Hartley share their identity with you? Councillor Tibbs, Miss Bryce replied without hesitation. Mr. Reginald Tibbs, chairman of the planning committee. Owen said he was a man of considerable influence, but regrettably little imagination when it came to covering his tracks. The railway yard provided convenient access for someone with the right municipal connections. At that moment, Sergeant Love returned from his expedition to verify the insurance arrangements, bearing the sort of expression that suggested discoveries both expected and unwelcome. The offices above the Temperance Hall are empty, Inspector. Neighbours report that Mr. C. Vogt departed last evening with considerable luggage and what one witness described as unseemly haste for a gentleman in the insurance business. How remarkably prompt of Mr. Vaux to seek advancement elsewhere, Purbright observed with characteristic understatement. And Councillor Tibbs, I assume he's available for consultation regarding these railway irregularities. Miss Bryce's composed expression suggested a woman who had been anticipating this particular question. Owen mentioned that Mr. Tibbs had been rather anxious about the timing of their final transaction, Inspector. He seemed particularly concerned that the matter be resolved before any complications might arise. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the office window, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the growing complexity of what had begun as a simple case of untimely heart failure. Purbright found himself contemplating the uncomfortable possibility that Owen Hartley's death, while undoubtedly natural, had occurred at a moment of remarkable convenience for someone whose municipal reputation was worth considerable effort to protect. Miss Bryce, he said gently, you've been most helpful. I trust Mr. Gash will understand if your return to the shop is delayed by these administrative necessities. She rose with the composed dignity of a woman who had successfully navigated treacherous conversational waters. Mr. Gash is understanding about civic duties, Inspector, though I should mention that he was one of the gentlemen who occasionally consulted with Owen about certain supply irregularities in his own business arrangements. As she reached the door, Miss Bryce paused with the air of someone remembering a small but significant detail. Inspector, if Owen's activities have caused difficulties for anyone in Flaxborough, I do hope you'll resolve them quickly. People are remarkably fond of blaming the nearest woman when gentlemen's business arrangements become complicated. We shall endeavour to disappoint them, Purbright replied, his smile courteous, though his eyes remained thoughtfully considering. When she had gone, the office felt simultaneously larger and more complex, as if Miss Bryce's departure had left behind not relief, but a series of carefully planted questions that would require considerably more investigation to resolve satisfactorily. After Miss Bryce's departure, the office settled into the sort of thoughtful quiet that follows conversations where more has been revealed than initially intended. Sergeant Love arranged his notes with the methodical precision of a man who understood that the morning's simple case of untimely death had evolved into something requiring considerably more systematic attention to detail. Remarkable composure for a woman who's just lost her intended, Love observed, consulting the ledger entries with renewed interest. One might almost think she was expecting complications. Purbright leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the contemplative manner that usually preceded his more productive lines of inquiry. "Indeed, Sergeant. Miss Bryce possesses either admirable self-control or detailed foreknowledge of her late fiancé's various enterprises. The distinction may prove significant." He paused, studying the insurance policy's red cover with the sort of attention usually reserved for potentially explosive documents. "A policy arranged just last Tuesday, payable within 30 days of marriage. Either Mr. Hartley was unusually pessimistic about matrimony, or unusually optimistic about financial opportunities." A knock at the door interrupted these reflections, followed by the reappearance of Mr. Winch, who entered with the harried expression of a man who had spent the intervening hour grappling with administrative irregularities that challenged his understanding of proper procedure. He clutched his manila folder with renewed determination, as if it contained evidence that might restore order to a morning that had persistently refused to follow established protocols. "Inspector Purbright," he began, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone delivering information that contradicted previous statements. "I've reviewed this morning's events more thoroughly, and I'm afraid Miss Bryce may have been somewhat creative in her description of the morning's paperwork." Purbright's expression suggested polite interest rather than surprise. In his experience, creative descriptions of administrative procedures usually preceded more substantial revelations about human behavior. "In what particular way, Mr. Winch?" "She claimed to have signed the marriage register at 11:20, Winch replied, consulting his folder with the nervous attention of a man whose professional reputation depended upon accurate record-keeping. However, marriage entries are signed only after the ceremony, in the presence of the officiant and witnesses. At 11:20, Miss Bryce was indeed in my office, but only to correct an error regarding her father's occupation, cabinet maker rather than joiner, she insisted. I initialed the alteration. No signatures relevant to marriage were made. The implications of this correction settled into the office atmosphere, like pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves into more logical configurations. Sergeant Love's expression suggested a man recalibrating his assessment of Miss Bryce's veracity, while Purbright absorbed the information with the sort of quiet satisfaction that accompanied the discovery of significant discrepancies in witness testimony. "And her demeanor during this correction?" Purbright inquired, though his tone suggested he anticipated the answer would prove illuminating. "Entirely businesslike," Winch replied with the sort of emphasis that suggested he had given this matter considerable thought. She asked quite calmly whether a widow might use her married name if she was not technically speaking married. I told her the question was hypothetical and best addressed at a more appropriate time. When Winch had departed, Purbright found himself contemplating the elegant complexity of Miss Bryce's position. Her insistence on the validity of a marriage that had never occurred suggested either touching devotion or calculated preparation for circumstances that required the legal protections of widowhood, without the inconvenience of actual matrimony. "Sergeant Love," he said, reaching for his hat, with the sort of purposeful attention that suggested the afternoon's investigation was entering a more active phase. "I believe we should pay a visit to Councillor Tibbs, a gentleman who makes substantial payments to blackmailers on the eve of their wedding days may possess insights into the deceased's final intentions." The walk to Market Street proceeded, through the sort of afternoon bustle that characterized Flaxborough's commercial district, where the morning's gossip had achieved the status of established fact and was being discussed with the authority, usually reserved for weather forecasts. Mrs. Cromwell, from the flower shop, emerged to observe their progress with undisguised curiosity, her expression suggesting someone who had spent the day collecting information that might prove valuable for evening social exchanges. Councillor Tibbs maintained offices above Hartwell's hardware shop, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked its protest at supporting the weight of municipal authority. The offices themselves reflected their occupant's position, respectable without being ostentatious, organized without suggesting excessive attention to detail, and bearing the sort of lived-in quality that comes from years of conducting business that occasionally required privacy from public scrutiny. Tibbs himself received them with the sort of nervous hospitality that suggested a man who had been anticipating official visitors while hoping they might be delayed indefinitely. He was a gentleman of perhaps 50, with the comfortable appearance that comes from regular meals and irregular exercise, and he possessed the sort of political manner that transformed anxiety into civic concern through careful attention to tone and posture. "Inspector Purbright," he said, rising from behind a desk that bore the accumulated paperwork of someone whose municipal responsibilities extended into areas that occasionally required delicate handling. A tragic business, this affair with young Hartley, though I must say, a man in his profession encounters stresses that might affect anyone's constitution. His profession being agricultural implements? Purbright inquired, settling into the offered chair with the sort of comfortable attention that encouraged detailed explanations. "Among other things," Tibbs replied with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation while hoping never to have it. Hartley was a man of considerable enterprise, perhaps too much enterprise for his own good. He had developed what he called supplementary income streams, which seemed to involve offering guidance to local businessmen regarding certain irregularities in their operations. Sergeant Love's notebook appeared with automatic efficiency, though his expression suggested a man who found municipal euphemisms more entertaining than enlightening. "And you availed yourself of such guidance, Counselor." "A modest consultation," Tibbs admitted, his hands arranging papers with unnecessary attention to geometric precision. Hartley claimed to have noticed discrepancies in the railway goods yard operations, items being redirected from legitimate shipments and sold through private arrangements. He suggested that as chairman of the planning committee, I might wish to address these irregularities before they attracted official attention. "For a fee," Purbright observed, though his tone suggested statement rather than accusation. "A donation to encourage discretion," Tibbs corrected, with the sort of careful distinction that transformed systematic blackmail into civic responsibility. £50 paid yesterday evening by the canal bridge. Hartley insisted on these informal arrangements, said official meetings left inconvenient records, and was anyone else present during this transaction? Tibbs shifted uncomfortably, his expression suggesting a man recalling details he had hoped to forget. There was a woman nearby on a bicycle. She kept circling the area as if waiting for something, or someone. Rather determined ankles she had, and the sort of purposeful manner that suggested punctuality mattered considerably more to her than it did to Hartley. "You didn't recognize her?" "I don't make a hobby of identifying evening cyclists," Tibbs replied with injured dignity, "though I did notice she wore a brown coat and carried what appeared to be a wicker basket. She seemed particularly interested in our conversation, though she maintained a discreet distance." As they prepared to leave, Purbright found himself reflecting that Owen Hartley's final evening had been considerably busier than a simple case of pre-wedding nervousness might suggest. The combination of substantial payments, mysterious cyclists, and carefully planned departures painted a picture of a man whose death had occurred at a moment of remarkable convenience for several parties. "One final question. Counselor," he said, pausing at the door with the sort of casual attention that made important inquiries seem routine. "Did Mr. Hartley mention any concerns about his health during your recent dealings?" Tibbs considered this carefully, his expression suggesting a man weighing the relative dangers of complete honesty against selective disclosure. "He did mention feeling rather unwell after the Women's Institute meeting on Tuesday evening. Said the refreshments hadn't agreed with him, though he seemed more concerned about the timing than the discomfort. Kept muttering about schedules and the importance of maintaining them, despite temporary indisposition." The afternoon sunlight slanted through the office windows as they descended to Market Street, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the growing complexity of what had begun as a straightforward case of natural death. Purbright found himself contemplating the uncomfortable possibility that Owen Hartley's heart failure, while undoubtedly genuine, might have been assisted by circumstances that extended beyond the normal stresses of commercial blackmail and matrimonial planning. "Sergeant Love," he said, as they walked back toward the station, "I believe we should make inquiries about Tuesday evening's Women's Institute meeting. It appears Mr. Hartley's final social engagement may have proved more significant than initially apparent." The investigation, Purbright reflected, was beginning to resemble one of Mrs. Polkinghorne's prize arrangements, carefully structured, deceptively simple on the surface, but revealing considerable complexity to anyone who examined the individual components with sufficient attention to detail. The Flaxborough Women's Institute occupied premises above Millicent's tea rooms, with the sort of determined respectability that comes from decades of organizing charitable events and managing the domestic complexities of community life. Mrs. Beatrice Chubb, who had served as secretary for the better part of 2 decades, received Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love with the gracious efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing unexpected visitors while maintaining the proper standards of hospitality. "Such a dreadful business about poor Mr. Hartley," she said, arranging teacups with the precision that characterized all her domestic activities. "Though I must say, Inspector, his attendance at Tuesday's meeting struck several of us as rather unusual. Gentlemen don't typically show interest in our discussions of jam-making and flower arranging." Mrs. Polkinghorne, whose morning triumph at the horticultural exhibition had left her in an expansive mood, nodded approvingly from her position near the window. "Indeed, most irregular, though Miss Bryce did explain that Mr. Hartley was researching local customs for some sort of pamphlet. Agricultural clients, she said, were interested in rural traditions." Purbright accepted the offered tea with the sort of careful attention that transformed social courtesy into professional inquiry. "What brought Mr. Hartley to your meeting, Mrs. Chubb?" "He claimed to be compiling information about market town culture," she replied, though her expression suggested a woman who had accepted this explanation while harboring private reservations about its complete accuracy. "He was particularly interested in our refreshment arrangements and asked detailed questions about who prepared what items. Rather forward for a gentleman making his first visit, I thought." Sergeant Love, whose own experience with Women's Institute meetings had been limited to consuming their charitable bake sale offerings, found himself studying the meeting room with renewed attention. The space bore the accumulated dignity of countless gatherings devoted to worthy causes and social improvement, though something in the arrangement of serving dishes suggested recent disruption of established patterns. "Did Mr. Hartley partake of the refreshments?" Purbright inquired, his tone suggesting nothing more than routine thoroughness. "Oh yes, quite enthusiastically," Mrs. Chubb replied, though her voice carried a note that suggested Hartley's appetite had exceeded the bounds of appropriate guest behavior. He was particularly taken with Miss Bryce's contribution, a lovely trifle with custard and fruit. She had prepared it specially, she said, using a recipe that had been in her family for generations. Mrs. Polkinghorne leaned forward with the sort of precision that accompanied her more significant observations. "Miss Bryce was most particular about serving Mr. Hartley personally, though our usual custom is to allow guests to help themselves from the refreshment table. She said she wanted to ensure he received the best portion, being a visitor and all." The significance of this information settled into the room's quiet atmosphere with the weight of revelation, disguised as domestic detail. Purbright's expression remained carefully neutral, though his fingers tightened slightly around his teacup, in the manner of a man who had just discovered a piece of evidence that transformed speculation into something approaching certainty. And Mr. Hartley's reaction to this special attention. "He seemed quite pleased initially," Mrs. Chubb continued, "though he did mention feeling rather warm afterward, asked if we might open a window, despite the evening being quite cool. Miss Bryce was most solicitous, offered to walk him partway home to ensure he was feeling better." Mrs. Polkinghorne consulted the small ornate watch pinned to her ample bosom with the precision of someone whose life was governed by accurate timekeeping. "This would have been precisely 8:30, Inspector. We were just about to begin the raffle for the knitted tea cozy." Mr. Hartley left rather abruptly via the front entrance, and Miss Bryce followed a few minutes later, though she took the side exit that leads to the alleyway behind the hall. "She mentioned needing to check something in her bicycle basket," Mrs. Chubb added, her tone suggesting careful recollection of details that had acquired new significance. "Said she had errands to run afterward that required efficient transportation. She seemed quite particular about the timing. Kept consulting her watch and mentioning appointments that couldn't be delayed." Sergeant Love had been examining the refreshment area with the methodical attention of a man who understood that domestic arrangements often concealed evidence of considerable significance. The serving dishes had been thoroughly cleaned, but Something about their arrangement suggested recent disturbance beyond normal washing-up procedures. There was one other thing about Tuesday evening that struck me as rather unusual, Mrs. Chubb continued, her voice lowered to the confidential tone reserved for sharing information that might prove significant. Miss Bryce lingered to help with the washing up, which isn't typical for her. She was particularly thorough about cleaning the serving dishes, said she wanted to ensure no food residue was left to attract mice. And her demeanor when she returned from checking her bicycle? Purbright asked, rising from his chair with the sort of purposeful attention that indicated the afternoon's investigation was approaching a crucial juncture. Mrs. Polkinghorne's expression suggested a woman accessing memories that had acquired uncomfortable clarity in light of subsequent events. Not distressed exactly, but more resolute, as if she had come to a difficult decision. She won the raffle, you know. The knitted tea cozy. She seemed quite pleased about that. As they prepared to leave, Purbright found himself contemplating the elegant simplicity of Miss Bryce's arrangements, a carefully prepared refreshment, solicitous attention to its consumption, convenient transportation for subsequent activities, and meticulous attention to cleaning away any inconvenient evidence. The timeline was acquiring the sort of precision that transformed coincidence into calculated planning. Hartley's illness at 8:30, his departure via the front entrance, Miss Bryce's exit through the alley with her bicycle, and her presence near the canal bridge during the following evening's payment transaction. "Sergeant Love," he said as they descended the narrow staircase to Market Street, where the normal bustle of commercial activity continued with determined obliviousness to the morning's complications, "I believe we're approaching the point where direct questions may prove more illuminating than continued observation of circumstantial evidence." The investigation had acquired the sort of focused clarity that comes when scattered details arrange themselves into patterns that explain both human behavior and its unfortunate consequences. What remained was the delicate task of encouraging Miss Bryce to confirm what the evidence had already suggested, that Owen Hartley's natural death had been assisted by someone who understood both the mechanics of poisoning and the importance of maintaining plausible alternatives to deliberate murder. The afternoon's remaining interviews, Purbright suspected, would prove considerably more direct than the morning's careful exploration of motives and opportunities. Miss Bryce had demonstrated remarkable composure throughout the day's revelations, but even the most carefully prepared explanations eventually encountered questions that required more than administrative precision to answer satisfactorily. The return to Gash's Drapers proceeded through streets where the afternoon's revelations had begun to settle into the comfortable rhythm of established scandal. Mrs. Cromwell from the flower shop emerged to observe their progress with the sort of interested attention that suggested she had spent considerable time correlating the morning's events with her own observations of local behavior patterns, while Mr. Plum from the butcher's shop paused in his doorway, with the expression of a man whose professional understanding of anatomy made him particularly curious about cases involving sudden death. Gash's Drapers occupied its corner position with the sort of commercial dignity that comes from decades of providing essential services to customers, whose domestic requirements rarely change dramatically from season to season. The shop windows displayed bolts of fabric arranged with mathematical precision, while the interior maintained the hushed atmosphere that characterized establishments where personal measurements and private alterations were discussed with appropriate discretion. Mr. Gash himself emerged from behind the counter with the measured courtesy of a tradesman, who understood that police visits, while unusual, required the same professional attention as any other business inquiry. His slightly stooped posture spoke of years examining fabric quality, while his careful expression suggested someone whose livelihood depended upon accurate assessment of human nature, a skill that had clearly been tested by the morning's revelations about his employees. "Domestic complications. Inspector Purbright," he said, his voice carrying controlled concern. "Miss Bryce has maintained her professional duties with admirable composure, though I confess the circumstances have attracted considerable attention from customers seeking information rather than merchandise." Miss Bryce appeared from the back room with the composed efficiency that had characterized her behavior throughout the day's revelations. She had changed from her wedding attire into the dark dress and white apron that constituted her professional uniform, though something in her posture suggested a woman who remained prepared for further administrative complications. Inspector. She acknowledged their arrival with calm, a tension that transformed official visits into routine business consultations. I trust your inquiries have proceeded satisfactorily. Mr. Gash has been most understanding about the morning's interruptions. Purbright examined the shop's interior with careful attention that made routine observations seem like professional thoroughness. The establishment possessed the accumulated dignity of decades devoted to measuring, cutting and fitting, though something about the arrangement of sewing supplies suggested recent attention to organizational details that extended beyond normal commercial requirements. Miss Bryce, he began, his tone carrying polite directness that preceded more challenging inquiries. Our investigation has revealed certain details regarding Tuesday evening's Women's Institute meeting that require clarification. Specifically, the nature of your refreshment contribution. Her composure showed the first signs of careful calculation, though her response carried measured precision. A trifle, Inspector, prepared according to my grandmother's recipe. Owen had mentioned his fondness for traditional desserts, and I thought it appropriate to contribute something that represented family traditions and the specific ingredients for this traditional preparation. The usual components: sponge cake, custard, fruit, and cream. She paused, her hands moving to adjust her apron with unnecessary precision. Though I did add almond extract to enhance the flavor. Owen was particularly fond of almonds. Sergeant Love's notebook appeared with automatic efficiency, though his expression suggested a man who understood that domestic recipes were acquiring significance beyond normal culinary considerations. The mention of almond extract had introduced possibilities that transformed innocent refreshments into something requiring considerably more careful examination. How much almond extract would you estimate? Miss Bryce? Perhaps a generous measure, she replied, though her voice carried the sort of careful neutrality that suggested awareness of the question's implications. I was anxious that the flavor be sufficiently pronounced. Owen had complained recently about the blandness of institutional catering. Mr. Gash, whose position behind the counter had allowed him to observe this exchange with growing uneasiness, cleared his throat meaningfully. Inspector, if these inquiries concern Miss Bryce's character, I should mention that she has been exemplary, punctual, reliable, and possessed of excellent judgment in matters requiring discretion. I'm certain she has, Purbright replied, though his attention remained focused on Miss Bryce with quiet intensity. Miss Bryce, our inquiries also suggest that your movements on Tuesday evening extended beyond the Institute meeting. Several witnesses place you near the canal bridge during Mr. Hartley's business transaction with Councillor Tibbs. For the first time that day, Miss Bryce's composure showed genuine uncertainty, her hands stilled on her apron, and her expression suggested a woman recalculating the relative advantages of continued evasion versus carefully administered honesty. I may have taken a longer route home, she admitted finally. Owen had mentioned conducting business, and I felt entitled to understand the nature of these arrangements. A woman has certain rights regarding her intended's financial circumstances. And what did you observe during this reconnaissance? Owen received substantial payment from Councillor Tibbs. £50 seemed excessive for agricultural consultations, particularly given the discretion with which it was conducted. Her tone suggested matter-of-fact observation rather than emotional involvement. At that moment, Constable Snipe appeared in the doorway with the breathless importance that characterized his approach to official duties. Beg pardon, Inspector, but there's been a development at the station. A lady called regarding the insurance documentation. Said the town clerk required it for urgent committee business. Young Perkins let her have it, sir. She had a proper note and everything. Purbright's expression suggested mild interest rather than surprise. Description of this lady? Brown coat, sir. Business-like manner, carried a wicker basket, and seemed particularly concerned about timing. Miss Bryce's reaction to this information was subtle but telling, not surprise, but the sort of resigned acknowledgement that suggested plans proceeding according to expectation. Her fingers smoothed her apron with the automatic precision of someone whose mind was occupied with calculations that extended beyond immediate conversation. "Miss Bryce," Purbright said gently, "it appears your administrative efficiency extends beyond the confines of this establishment. Might I suggest that further discussion would benefit from more private circumstances?" She nodded with the composed acceptance of a woman who understood that certain conversations were inevitable, although her glance toward Mr. Gash suggested concern for maintaining professional relationships despite personal complications. "Mr. Gash," she said with careful formality, "I may be somewhat delayed in completing this afternoon's inventory. The inspector's inquiries appear to require rather more detailed attention than initially anticipated." As they prepared to leave, Purbright found himself reflecting that Miss Bryce's approach to complex problems possessed the sort of methodical precision that transformed domestic arrangements into something approaching military strategy. The careful timing of refreshments, the systematic removal of evidence, and the preemptive acquisition of potentially incriminating documentation suggested planning that extended considerably beyond normal. Responses to matrimonial difficulties. The investigation had reached the point where circumstantial evidence was arranging itself into patterns that explained both human behavior and its unfortunate consequences. What remained was the delicate task of encouraging Miss Bryce to complete the narrative she had so carefully begun, though Purbright suspected that her cooperation would prove as precisely calculated as everything else about her remarkable domestic arrangements. The walk back to the station proceeded through streets where the afternoon's revelations had begun to settle into the comfortable rhythm of established scandal. Miss Bryce maintained her composed demeanor between Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love, though something in her measured pace suggested a woman who understood that the day's administrative complications were approaching their inevitable conclusion. The evening light cast long shadows across Market Street, where Mr. Plum emerged from his butcher's shop to observe their progress, with the sort of professional interest that comes from years of understanding the precise timing required for successful domestic arrangements. The interview room at the Flaxborough Constabulary possessed the sort of quiet dignity that encouraged thoughtful conversation rather than dramatic confrontation. Its single window overlooked the courtyard, where Constable Snipe could be seen conducting his evening inspection of the bicycle shed with characteristic thoroughness, while the air carried the accumulated atmosphere of decades devoted to resolving Flaxborough's various domestic complications. Through patient inquiry and careful documentation, Inspector Purbright arranged the day's accumulated evidence across the polished oak table with methodical precision. Owen Hartley's leather ledger, the insurance policy and its red cover, the Dover Railway timetable, and finally, a small glass bottle that had been retrieved from the Women's Institute waste bin during the afternoon's more thorough investigations. Miss Bryce observed these preparations with calm attention, her hands folded in her lap, with the sort of stillness that suggested either admirable self-control or careful calculation of remaining options. "Miss Bryce," Purbright began, his voice carrying the measured courtesy that had served him well through 2 decades of encouraging reluctant witnesses to share information they preferred to keep private. "Our investigation has revealed a rather more complex situation than simple bereavement following natural death. The evidence suggests that Mr. Hartley's final arrangements possessed considerable sophistication." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his observation without committing to any particular interpretation of its significance. "Owen was always thorough in his planning, Inspector. He believed that success in commercial endeavors required attention to details that others might overlook." "Indeed," Purbright agreed, opening the ledger to display its systematic entries. "His supplementary income arrangements demonstrate remarkable organizational ability. £50 from Councillor Tibbs alone, sufficient resources for a comfortable journey, perhaps to establish new opportunities elsewhere." Miss Bryce's gaze moved to the Dover timetable with the sort of careful attention that suggested recognition rather than surprise. "Owen often spoke of continental business opportunities. He said that a man of enterprise shouldn't limit himself to domestic markets when European commerce offered such promising prospects." Sergeant Love, positioned near the window where the evening light provided adequate illumination for note-taking, found himself studying Miss Bryce's responses with growing appreciation for the precision with which she managed to acknowledge facts while avoiding inconvenient admissions of personal knowledge. Her composure possessed the sort of professional quality that came from years of managing difficult customers in establishments where discretion mattered considerably. More than dramatic revelation, the insurance policy presents particular interest, Purbright continued, lifting the red-covered document with deliberate care. A marriage contingency policy, arranged just last Tuesday, payable in the event of death within 30 days of lawful marriage. Either Mr. Hartley possessed remarkable pessimism about matrimonial longevity, or he understood something about his future circumstances that wasn't immediately apparent to casual observers. For the first time during the interview, Miss Bryce's composure showed hairline cracks of genuine calculation. Her fingers moved to adjust her gloves with unnecessary precision, while her gaze remained fixed on the insurance policy with the sort of focused attention that suggested internal review of carefully prepared explanations. Owen was always concerned about providing security, she said finally, her voice carrying measured consideration. He said that marriage was a serious responsibility, and that prudent gentlemen should prepare for contingencies that might affect their ability to fulfill domestic obligations, including the contingency of immediate departure to Dover. The question settled into the room's quiet atmosphere with the weight of accusation disguised as professional curiosity. Miss Bryce met Purbright's gaze with steady attention, though something in her expression suggested a woman who had reached the point where carefully administered honesty might prove more useful than continued evasion. Owen's business arrangements occasionally required flexible travel schedules, she replied with careful precision. He mentioned that certain opportunities might arise that would necessitate immediate action, regardless of personal convenience. Purbright reached for the small glass bottle, holding it up to catch the evening light that streamed through the window. The container bore the unmistakable residue of its former contents, while its size suggested domestic use rather than commercial application. This was discovered in the Women's Institute waste bin. Miss Bryce, it bears your fingerprints and contains traces of bitter almond extract, a substance that, in sufficient concentration, can produce symptoms remarkably similar to natural heart failure. The silence that followed this revelation possessed the particular quality that accompanies the presentation of evidence that transforms speculation into something approaching certainty. Miss Bryce's hands stilled completely, while her expression suggested a woman who had been anticipating this moment, while hoping it might be delayed indefinitely. I used almond extract in the trifle, she acknowledged, her voice carrying calm directness. Owen had mentioned his fondness for traditional flavoring, and I wished to ensure the refreshment met his expectations. A generous measure. According to your earlier statement, Purbright observed, though his tone suggested patient inquiry rather than immediate accusation, perhaps generous enough to cause the sort of temporary indisposition that might facilitate certain business arrangements, requiring privacy from public observation. Miss Bryce's composure showed the first signs of genuine uncertainty, though her response carried the measured tone of someone who had given considerable thought to appropriate explanations. Owen's reaction to the refreshment was more pronounced than I had anticipated, Inspector. I was concerned that my enthusiasm for proper flavoring might have exceeded the bounds of culinary wisdom, and yet you felt sufficiently concerned about his welfare to follow him partway home, and later to observe his business transaction with Councillor Tibbs. A woman has certain responsibilities regarding her intended's activities, she replied with careful formality, particularly when those activities involve substantial financial arrangements that might affect future domestic security. As the evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the elegant complexity of Miss Bryce's position. Her responses possessed the sort of systematic precision that acknowledged facts while maintaining plausible alternatives to more dramatic interpretations, though the accumulated evidence was beginning to suggest possibilities that extended considerably beyond accidental over-enthusiasm with domestic flavoring. Miss Bryce, he said gently, I believe we're approaching the point where complete honesty will serve your interests better than continued creative interpretation of Tuesday evening's domestic arrangements. The evidence suggests that Mr. Hartley's death, while medically natural, occurred under circumstances that someone had taken considerable care to arrange. She rose from her chair with composed dignity, moving to the window where Constable Snipe could be seen completing his evening rounds with characteristic thoroughness. When she turned back to face them, her expression carried the sort of resigned determination that suggested a woman who had reached conclusions about the relative advantages of continued silence versus carefully administered. "Revelation, Inspector," she said quietly. "Owen Hartley was not the gentleman I initially believed him to be. His courtship proceeded with admirable efficiency, but his ultimate intentions regarding marriage were considerably more temporary than a woman in my position had reason to expect." The evening light continued its slow fade across Flaxborough's market square as Inspector Purbright prepared to receive what he suspected would prove to be the morning's final and most illuminating administrative clarification. Miss Bryce's remarkable composure had carried her through a day of increasingly complex revelations, but even the most carefully prepared explanations eventually encountered questions that required more than domestic precision to answer satisfactorily. Miss Bryce returned to her chair with the measured composure of a woman who had arrived at the point where carefully administered truth might prove more advantageous than continued administrative precision. She arranged her skirts with automatic attention to propriety, though something in her posture suggested the sort of resigned determination that comes from understanding that certain conversations were inevitable, regardless of personal preference for privacy in domestic matters. "Owen's courtship proceeded with admirable efficiency," she began, her voice carrying the precise tone of someone presenting a business report rather than a confession of murder. 3 months of regular walks, appropriate gifts, and what I believe to be genuine affection. However, I discovered that his intentions regarding matrimony were considerably more temporary than a woman in my position had reason to expect." Inspector Purbright leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting polite interest rather than judgment. In his experience, the most illuminating confessions usually began with careful attention to chronology and motivation, particularly when delivered by individuals whose approach to complex problems demonstrated systematic planning rather than emotional impulse. "I overheard Owen at the post office on Monday evening," Miss Bryce continued, her hands folded with perfect stillness. "He was arranging travel documents, not for Bournemouth, but for Dover and ultimately Buenos Aires. He spoke of administrative resolution of his Flaxborough commitments and mentioned that his domestic obligations would be concluded by Thursday morning." Sergeant Love's pencil moved across his notebook with methodical precision, though his expression suggested a man who found the mechanics of systematic deception more fascinating than shocking. The evening's revelations were arranging themselves into patterns that explained both human behavior and its unfortunate consequences with characteristic Flaxborough logic. "Thursday being the day after your intended wedding," Purbright observed, though his tone suggested statement rather than question. "Indeed. Owen's plan appeared to involve marriage on Wednesday, immediate departure on Thursday, and what he described as clean resolution of his various consulting arrangements through means that wouldn't require his continued presence." Her voice carried the sort of controlled precision that comes from discovering that one's future had been arranged according to someone else's convenience. "You realized that this would leave both his clients and yourself in rather awkward circumstances." Miss Bryce's composure showed the first hairline crack of genuine emotion, not grief, but the sort of practical anger that comes from being treated as an administrative detail in someone else's business arrangements. "A widow receives sympathy, Inspector. An abandoned wife receives speculation about her adequacy as a domestic partner." Owen understood the social mathematics perfectly, and so you decided to ensure that widowhood occurred according to a more convenient timeline. Owen had mentioned his fondness for traditional desserts and his occasional difficulties with rich foods. The almond extract was intended to create sufficient indisposition to delay his departure, while I arranged certain practical matters. She paused, her gaze moving to the small glass bottle on the table. However, his constitution proved less robust than I had calculated. Inspector Purbright reached for Owen Hartley's insurance policy, examining its red cover with deliberate attention. The marriage contingency policy suggests that your planning extended beyond simple domestic inconvenience. Owen was quite thorough in explaining the policy's advantages. Miss Bryce replied with matter-of-fact precision. Benefits payable within 30 days of lawful marriage, he said, provided excellent security for a prudent woman. I merely ensured that the timing worked to my advantage rather than his. By administering a dose of almond extract, sufficient to produce heart failure after the ceremony but before his planned departure, the timing required careful calculation, she acknowledged, with the sort of professional pride that transformed systematic poisoning into domestic efficiency. Owen was always particular about schedules when they served his convenience. I simply ensured that for once punctuality worked in my favor. The room settled into thoughtful silence as the evening shadows lengthened across Flaxborough's market square. Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the elegant simplicity of Miss Bryce's solution to what had indeed been a complex domestic problem, though achieved through methods that extended considerably beyond conventional social arrangements. Miss Bryce, he said gently, I believe we understand the circumstances that led to Tuesday evening's unfortunate outcome. What remains is determining how justice might best be served while acknowledging the particular pressures that influenced your decision. She met his gaze with steady attention, her expression carrying the sort of calm acceptance that suggested a woman who had completed the most difficult part of a conversation she had been both dreading and anticipating since the moment Owen Hartley's various enterprises had begun to reveal their true nature. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences the law requires. Inspector, she replied with quiet formality, though I hope the circumstances will be considered when determining the appropriate response to what began as reasonable self-protection against systematic deception. As the evening light continued its slow fade across the commercial district, Inspector Purbright prepared to conclude an investigation that had evolved from simple bereavement into something considerably more complex, though no less human in its essential motivations. Miss Bryce's remarkable composure had carried her through revelations that would have tested anyone's administrative capabilities, but even the most carefully prepared domestic arrangements eventually encountered questions that required more than systematic planning to resolve satisfactorily. The formal conclusion of Miss Bryce's statement required the sort of administrative precision that had characterized her approach to the morning's various complications. Inspector Purbright arranged the accumulated evidence with methodical care. The ledger, the insurance policy, the small glass bottle that had contained rather more almond extract than traditional recipes typically required. Miss Bryce, he said, rising with the measured courtesy that transformed arrests into administrative procedures, I believe we understand the circumstances completely. Your cooperation has been exemplary, though the methods you employed extend somewhat beyond conventional responses to matrimonial disappointment. She acknowledged this observation with calm acceptance, adjusting her gloves with automatic precision. I hope the court will consider that Owen's behavior demonstrated a systematic disregard for the reasonable expectations of women who enter into matrimonial arrangements with sincere intentions. The magistrate's chambers possess the sort of municipal dignity that made legal proceedings seem like particularly formal committee meetings. Magistrate Chubb examined the evidence with judicial thoroughness, though his expression suggested a man who found Miss Bryce's systematic approach to domestic difficulties more administratively impressive than morally shocking. Remarkable precision in the planning, he observed, studying the insurance policy with professional interest. Though the provocation appears considerable, a gentleman who arranges matrimony as a convenient prelude to abandonment demonstrates questionable character, regardless of commercial advantages. Miss Bryce's formal plea proceeded with characteristic efficiency. She described Owen Hartley's deceptive courtship and her calculated response with factual precision that transformed systematic poisoning into something approaching justifiable domestic management. The court, perhaps swayed by Flaxborough's particular understanding of social contracts, delivered a verdict that balanced legal requirements against community standards. 2 years, suspended, Magistrate Chubb announced, conditional upon good behavior and community service. The defendant's complete cooperation and the extraordinary provocation merit consideration. The legal formalities concluded with characteristic Flaxborough efficiency. Miss Bryce returned to Gash's Drapers, where her experience managing complex administrative arrangements proved valuable with demanding customers. Mr. Gash, demonstrating unexpected loyalty, declared that a woman capable of such systematic planning was precisely what the establishment required for its more challenging accounts. Owen Hartley's various consulting enterprises were quietly absorbed into local memory as cautionary examples of excessive commercial creativity. Councillor Tibbs discovered renewed enthusiasm for transparent municipal procedures, while the Women's Institute implemented more rigorous oversight of contributed refreshments. Mrs. Chubb announced that future meetings would feature only purchased items from establishments with proper health certificates. The insurance policy remained unclaimed in the station's evidence files, its red cover a reminder that even carefully planned domestic arrangements occasionally required official intervention. The Dover timetable was returned to the railway office, where it resumed its proper function of facilitating legitimate travel rather than supporting elaborate deception schemes. Inspector Purbright returned to his office, where routine paperwork awaited with patient inevitability. The morning's simple case of untimely death had evolved into something considerably more complex, though resolved through characteristic Flaxborough logic that acknowledged both legal requirements and social realities. As evening settled over the market square, the day's complications arranged themselves into comfortable patterns of established routine. The horticultural exhibition had concluded with appropriate ceremony. Mrs. Polkinghorne's roses had received deserved recognition, and domestic arrangements had been restored to proper equilibrium through patient inquiry and careful attention to human nature's complexities. Mrs. Spink found a new lodger, a retired schoolmaster, whose habits promised to be entirely conventional. The parish hall's bunting fluttered with non-committal cheer, while somewhere in town the story was already being retold with improvements that would make it shorter, truer, and considerably more entertaining by week's end. Inspector Purbright locked his office door with satisfaction. He reflected, successfully avoided both melodrama and excessive involvement in horticultural matters, which represented no small triumph on exhibition day. The bride who had married the dead had, through systematic planning and administrative precision, achieved a form of justice that conventional arrangements had failed to provide. Outside, Flaxborough resumed its quiet rhythms, though perhaps with slightly enhanced appreciation for the hidden complexities that occasionally disrupted the surface calm of respectable domestic life. The end.